November 15th, 1993. Miguel Herrera was milking his cow when the most wanted man in the world knocked on his barn door. Pablo Escobar stood there, bleeding, desperate, with a briefcase chained to his wrist. Miguel had 30 seconds to decide: help the devil or watch him die. He chose mercy. That choice should have ended with Escobar's death 2 weeks later. But 30 years later, a woman showed up at Miguel's farm with photographs of that night. Photographs that proved someone else was watching, someone who knew about the briefcase, someone who understood what Escobar really left behind. The cartel wars were never about cocaine. They were about what Miguel buried under his coffee trees the morning after Pablo died. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you: the weight of coffee beans. Miguel's hands trembled as he poured his morning coffee, the same tremor that had plagued him for 30 years whenever strangers came up the mountain road. The woman sitting across from his kitchen table had introduced herself as Sarah Martinez, freelance journalist from Miami, but her Spanish carried no Cuban lilt, no Mexican warmth. Her accent was manufactured, practiced in classrooms rather than cantinas. "You have a beautiful farm, Señor Herrera," she said, her camera resting casually on the wooden table between them. "How long have you worked this land?" "All my life." Miguel's voice came out rougher than intended. Through the window he could see his granddaughter Isabella picking coffee beans with the seasonal workers. 18 years old, university-bound, everything he had sacrificed for, wrapped up in her bright smile and quick mind. "My father planted the first trees in 1962. Sarah nodded, making notes in a leather journal. "And you've never thought about selling? Moving closer to the city? This area has such a complicated history." There it was, the probe. Miguel had been expecting it since she'd driven up in her rented Toyota an hour ago, claiming she was researching rural farming communities for a book about post-conflict Colombia. But journalists researching agriculture didn't carry telephoto lenses or know to park facing downhill for a quick exit. "History is history," Miguel said. "Coffee grows the same regardless." "Of course." Sarah's smile never wavered. "Though I imagine you must have stories. This area was Pablo Escobar's territory, wasn't it? Did you ever encounter the cartels during those years?" Miguel set down his cup carefully, buying time. In the distance, a motorcycle engine echoed off the mountain walls, too far to worry about, but his nervous system no longer distinguished between real and imagined threats. Every sound could be the beginning of the end. Many people lived here then. Many people died here then. I kept to my farm. It wasn't entirely a lie. He had kept to his farm, even that night, especially that night. When Escobar had stumbled through his barn door, clutching his side where blood seeped through his expensive shirt, Miguel hadn't thought about right or wrong. He'd seen a man bleeding and acted on instinct. The briefcase had been the problem. Sarah leaned forward slightly, and Miguel caught a glimpse of something tucked under her jacket. Not a gun, he'd learned to spot those, but possibly a recording device. Local stories fascinate me. The human side of history, you know. How ordinary people survived extraordinary times by minding their own business. Smart strategy. She paused, seeming to study his face. Though sometimes circumstances don't allow for that luxury. Sometimes ordinary people get pulled into events beyond their control. Miguel stood abruptly. "More coffee?" "No, thank you." Sarah's hand moved to her camera. "Actually, I was hoping you might show me around the property. I'd love to photograph some of the older coffee trees, the ones that would have been here in the 90s. Every alarm bell Miguel had developed over 30 years of paranoia screamed at once. She wanted to see the trees, specifically the trees from that era, the trees he'd replanted in a careful pattern, creating natural landmarks only he could read. "The terrain is difficult," he said, "not safe for visitors." "I'm quite experienced with rough terrain." Sarah stood as well, slinging her camera bag over her shoulder. "I insist. For the book." Through the window, Miguel watched Isabella laugh at something one of the workers had said. Her acceptance letter to Universidad Nacional sat framed on his mantel, right next to a photo of her dead parents, his daughter and son-in-law, killed by a drunk driver when Isabella was 8. She was his second chance at raising a child right. His opportunity to break the cycle of violence that had claimed too many lives in these mountains. Sarah followed his gaze. Your granddaughter? Yes. Beautiful girl. She looks like someone with a bright future ahead of her. The threat hung in the air like morning mist, delicate but unmistakable. Miguel turned back to find Sarah watching him with different eyes now, colder, more focused. The coffee trees, he said quietly. The coffee trees. Miguel nodded toward the door. As they stepped outside, he caught Isabella's eye and touched his nose. Their old signal from when she was small, meaning stay close to the workers, don't wander off alone. She frowned but nodded, understanding that something had shifted in her grandfather's demeanor. Sarah adjusted her camera strap and smiled that practice smile again. Lead the way, Señor Herrera. I'm particularly interested in the southeastern section of your property. I understand the soil composition there is quite unique. Miguel's blood turned to ice water. The southeastern section, where the old growth stood tallest, where the shadows fell deepest, where 30 years ago he'd buried something that should have stayed buried forever. As they walked toward the trees, Miguel wondered if today would be the day his 30-year-old debt finally came due. The weight of memory. The morning sun carved long shadows through the coffee plantation as Miguel led Sarah down the familiar dirt path, his worn boots finding purchase on ground that had shaped his entire existence. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself was trying to hold him back from what lay ahead. The soil beneath his feet had absorbed 60 years of his sweat, 30 years of his secrets, and now threatened to give up both. He had walked this path 10,000 times, but never with such dread pooling in his stomach like spoiled milk. To his left, the newer plantings caught the light. Neat rows of coffee trees he'd cultivated over the past decade, their branches heavy with ripening cherries that would fund Isabella's second year at university. To his right, older trees climbed the hillside in irregular patterns, their placement seeming random to untrained eyes but marking a careful geography only Miguel could decode. You must have been very young when you started working this land, Sarah said behind him, her voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. She moved with surprising grace for someone claiming to be a city journalist, her steps confident on the uneven terrain. 16, Miguel replied, allowing himself the luxury of a true memory. My father died that year. Heart attack during the harvest. I had to choose between school and keeping the farm. The choice had been simple then. Isabel, his wife, not his granddaughter, was pregnant with Carmen, their first child. The coffee trees didn't care about his dreams of becoming a teacher in Medellin. They needed tending, and the land demanded its due. A breeze stirred the leaves above them, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across Sarah's notepad. Miguel noticed she wasn't actually writing anything, just making small marks that could pass for note-taking from a distance. Professional theater, like everything else about her. It must have been difficult, she continued, raising a family in such isolation, especially during the violent years. The violent years. As if violence had been a weather pattern that had simply passed through the mountains like a particularly bad rainy season. Miguel's left hand unconsciously moved to his ribs, where a scar from a bullet graze had long since faded to a thin white line. A gift from 1985, when he'd been in the wrong place during a firefight between army patrols and sicarios. He'd learned quickly that neutrality required more than just intention. It demanded invisibility. We managed, he said. They passed the shrine Isabella had built for her parents 2 years ago. A small wooden cross, surrounded by stones she'd painted with pictures of coffee flowers. Every Sunday after Mass, she brought fresh flowers there, usually talking quietly to the painted stones about her week, her studies, her boyfriend Carlos, who worked at the bank in town. Miguel had never told her that he often stood at his bedroom window on Sunday evenings, watching her maintain this ritual of love and loss. She reminds me of my daughter at that age, Sarah said, following his gaze to where Isabella moved between the coffee trees, her long black hair catching the sunlight. Full of dreams, ready to conquer the world, Miguel stopped walking. You have children? Had. Sarah's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw underneath. Car accident, 3 years ago. The lie felt different from her others, smoother, more practiced, as if she'd told it so many times it had worn grooves in her throat. Miguel recognized the technique because he'd perfected it himself, creating comfortable untruths that explained away the careful distance he maintained from his neighbors. The way he never traveled beyond the valley, the reason he'd never remarried after Isabel's death from cancer 12 years ago. They resumed walking, entering the older section of the plantation where the trees grew taller and the canopy thicker. Here the temperature dropped several degrees, and the sounds of the workers faded behind walls of green. Miguel's chest tightened as they approached the southeastern border of his property, where the forest pressed close against his carefully maintained rows of coffee. The trees here look different, Sarah observed, raising her camera. Older, more established. Planted by my father, Miguel lied smoothly. These trees were his own work, planted in the summer of 1993 to hide the disturbed earth beneath. He'd chosen saplings carefully, species that would grow quickly and root deeply, their expanding network of roots ensuring that the ground would never be easily excavated. Sarah knelt beside one particularly large tree, running her fingers over its trunk. Fascinating. And you've never had any problems with the soil composition? Sometimes when land has been disturbed, it can affect the growth patterns. Miguel's mouth went dry. She wasn't talking about agriculture anymore. The soil here has always been good for coffee. I'm sure it has. Sarah stood, brushing dirt from her hands. I'd love to get some photographs before the light changes. Would you mind if we spent a little more time in this area? Time. The one thing Miguel couldn't afford to give her. Every minute they lingered here was another minute for her real purpose to reveal itself. Another minute for Isabella to wonder why her grandfather had disappeared into the forest with a stranger. He nodded anyway, because refusing would only confirm what she already suspected. As Sarah began photographing the trees with methodical precision, Miguel closed his eyes and tried to remember what peace felt like. The first photograph clicked like a bone breaking. Miguel opened his eyes to find Sarah crouched beside the cecropia tree he'd planted directly over the grave, her telephoto lens capturing details of bark texture and root structure with forensic precision. Each shutter click felt like an accusation, like the earth itself was confessing secrets he'd spent 3 decades keeping buried. Interesting growth pattern, she murmured, adjusting her angle. The root system here seems to have spread in a very deliberate circle, almost like something underneath influenced the distribution. Miguel's throat closed. He forced himself to breathe normally, to maintain the facade of a simple farmer showing his land to an interested visitor. But his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly as he gripped the worn leather strap of the work satchel he carried everywhere. The same satchel that had once held documents he'd never dared to read. Sarah lowered her camera and reached into her jacket pocket. Actually, Señor Herrera, I should be more honest about why I'm here. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Miguel felt 30 years of carefully constructed normalcy beginning to crack like old paint in the sun. This was the moment he'd been dreading since the night he'd helped a bleeding man disappear into the mountains, since the morning he'd found the briefcase left behind in his barn. I'm not writing a book about farming communities, Sarah continued, pulling out a manila envelope that looked far too familiar. I'm here because of these. With movements that felt ceremonial, almost ritualistic, she opened the envelope and withdrew a series of black and white photographs. The images were grainy, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from a considerable distance, but Miguel recognized them instantly. His younger self, 30 years lighter and 40 pounds heavier, helping a wounded man stumble from the tree line toward his barn. The timestamp in the corner read December 2nd, 1993. Miguel's vision narrowed to a tunnel. The photographs were impossible. He'd been so careful that night, had waited until the military patrols moved on, had checked the ridgelines for watchers, but there they were, evidence of the moment that had divided his life into before and after. The Colombian government has been very interested in Pablo Escobar's final days, Sarah said, her voice now carrying authority instead of manufactured warmth, particularly in identifying who might have helped him evade capture during those last weeks. Miguel began, then stopped. The photographs made denials pointless. Sarah spread the images on the ground between them like tarot cards revealing an unwanted future. December 2nd, 1993. 2 days before Escobar was killed in Medellin. These were taken by a DEA surveillance team positioned on the ridge above your property. They lost visual contact during a storm that night, but the cameras kept running. Miguel stared at the images of his younger self, remembering the weight of Escobar's arm across his shoulders, the desperation in the drug lord's eyes as he begged for sanctuary. Not the monster from the newspapers, just a man who knew he was going to die and wanted one more night above ground. The briefcase, Sarah continued, producing another photograph that showed Miguel helping Escobar carry something rectangular toward the barn. Whatever was in it was important enough that Escobar chose to keep it with him even while fleeing for his life. Important enough that he'd risk exposing himself to a stranger. The morning air grew thick, oppressive. Miguel could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, drowning out the distant sounds of Isabella working among the coffee trees. His granddaughter, everything, pure and hopeful in his life, was less than 100 yards away, completely unaware that her world was about to implode. "What do you want?" he whispered. Sarah began gathering the photographs with practiced efficiency. The briefcase, Señor Herrera. After 30 years, certain people have decided it's time to recover what Escobar left behind. I don't have it. You know where it is. She gestured toward the cecropia tree, its massive trunk standing sentinel over secrets that should never see daylight again. The question is whether you're going to help us retrieve it voluntarily, or if we need to involve Isabella in our conversation. The threat hit Miguel like a physical blow. In that instant, 30 years of careful distance from his past collapsed into a single, crystalline moment of terror. He looked toward the coffee trees where Isabella worked, her laughter still audible on the morning breeze, and realized that the peaceful life he'd built for them both had always been an illusion. The debt had come due, and the price was going to be everything he'd spent 3 decades trying to protect. Miguel's mind raced like a trapped animal searching for escape routes that didn't exist. The photographs lay scattered at his feet like fallen leaves, each image a nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed life. He had to think, had to find a way to protect Isabella without giving Sarah what she wanted. But 30 years of peace had made him soft, unprepared for this moment. "I need time," he said, his voice barely audible above the rustling coffee leaves. Sarah's smile returned, but it carried no warmth. "Time is a luxury neither of us has, Señor Herrera. My associates are not known for their patience." Associates. The word sent ice through Miguel's veins. He found himself scanning the tree line automatically, a skill he'd thought buried with his paranoid past. How many were watching? How long had they been there? One day, he managed. "Give me until tomorrow morning." 12 hours, Sarah countered, checking her watch with theatrical precision. "Midnight tonight. That should give you plenty of time to remember where you put things." She gathered the photographs and tucked them back into her jacket, but left one behind, the clearest image of Miguel helping Escobar toward the barn, a reminder of what she held over him. As they walked back through the plantation, Miguel's legs felt unsteady, as if the familiar ground had turned treacherous beneath his feet. Isabella spotted them approaching and waved, her face bright with the unconscious happiness of someone whose world hadn't yet cracked open. Miguel managed to wave back, but the gesture felt like a lie. "Abuelo!" Isabella called out, jogging toward them with dirt on her hands and coffee beans in her apron pockets. "I found beetle damage in Sector 3. We should spray tomorrow." "Yes," Miguel said automatically, though the words seemed to come from somewhere outside his body. "Tomorrow." Isabella looked between him and Sarah, her expression growing concerned. She had inherited her grandmother's intuition along with her dark eyes, and Miguel knew she sensed the change in atmospheric pressure that preceded storms. "Are you feeling well?" she asked, switching to Spanish and placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You look pale." Sarah watched this exchange with predatory interest, and Miguel realized she understood more Spanish than she'd let on. Another deception in a conversation built entirely on lies. "Just tired," Miguel replied, forcing steadiness into his voice. "The heat." Isabella frowned but nodded. "I'll finish the survey and start dinner early. You should rest." She turned to Sarah with polite curiosity. "Will you be joining us, Senora?" "Unfortunately, I have to return to town," Sarah said, shouldering her camera bag. "But thank you for the invitation. Your grandfather has been most helpful." The emphasis on the last word made Miguel's stomach clench. Sarah was already establishing ownership, marking territory like a predator claiming a kill. After Sarah's Toyota disappeared down the mountain road, Miguel stood in his doorway watching the dust settle. The afternoon stretched ahead like a countdown, each passing minute bringing him closer to an impossible choice. He thought about running, throwing Isabella in his old pickup and driving until the gas ran out, but he knew it was pointless. People with photographs and associates didn't make threats they couldn't enforce. "Abuelo?" Isabella's voice came from the kitchen, concerned and questioning. Miguel forced himself to move, to maintain the rhythm of normal life even as everything crumbled around him. He found Isabella preparing plantains, her movements efficient and unconsciously graceful. She looked up when he entered, and he saw his own worry reflected in her eyes. "Who was that woman really?" she asked quietly. Miguel's first instinct was to lie, to protect her with false reassurances. But Isabella was 20 years old, not 8. She deserved better than comfortable deceptions. "Someone from my past," he said carefully. "What kind of past?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Miguel looked at his granddaughter, this brilliant, hopeful young woman who believed the world was fundamentally good because he'd worked so hard to make it seem that way, and realized he was about to shatter her faith in everything she thought she knew about him. "The kind that doesn't stay buried," he said. Isabella set down her knife and turned to face him fully. "Are we in danger?" The simple directness of the question broke something loose in Miguel's chest. No pretense, no deflection, just the clear-eyed courage of someone who needed to know how afraid to be. "I don't know," he admitted. It was the first completely honest thing he'd said all day, and it tasted like ashes in his mouth. Isabella nodded slowly, processing this admission with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Miguel looked at her, his second chance at redemption, his reason for 30 years of careful choices, and felt the weight of his past settling over them both like a shroud. Outside, a motorcycle engine echoed off the mountains, growing closer. The motorcycle's engine cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt like held breath. Miguel moved to the window, his movements careful and deliberate, the way he'd learned to move during the violent years when sudden motions could mean death. Through the gap in the curtains, he saw a single rider dismounting near the gate. Young, lean, wearing the kind of expensive leather jacket that didn't belong in these mountains. "Get away from the window," Miguel whispered to Isabella, his voice carrying an authority she'd never heard before. She obeyed instantly, backing toward the kitchen's rear door, and Miguel realized she was already learning the choreography of fear. The knowledge sat like a stone in his chest. In the space of one afternoon, he'd begun teaching his granddaughter skills no 20-year-old should need. The rider wasn't approaching the house. Instead, he leaned against his motorcycle and lit a cigarette, performing the casual theater of someone with all the time in the world. But Miguel could see the calculation in his posture, the way his eyes swept the property's sightlines. This wasn't Sarah's clumsy psychological pressure. This was professional surveillance. "Is there another way out?" Isabella asked quietly. Miguel nodded toward the kitchen's back door, which opened onto a path leading to the old storage shed, and beyond that, the forest. But he knew running would only delay the inevitable. These people, whoever they were, had found him after 30 years. They wouldn't lose him again. "Stay close to me," he said. They moved through the house like ghosts, avoiding the floorboards that creaked, keeping below the window lines. Miguel's mind cataloged escape routes and hiding places with rusty precision, muscle memory returning from a time when survival meant thinking 3 moves ahead of death. In the shed, among bags of coffee fertilizer and rusted farm tools, Miguel knelt beside a wooden crate that hadn't been disturbed in over a decade. His hands shook as he lifted the lid, revealing the .38 revolver he'd hoped never to touch again. The weight of it in his palm brought back memories of December 1993 with vivid clarity. Not just the night he'd helped Escobar, but everything that had followed. "Dios mío," Isabella breathed, staring at the weapon. "Abuelo, what did you do?" The question he'd been dreading for 30 years, asked by the person whose opinion mattered most. Miguel checked the cylinder, still loaded, though the bullets were old enough to be unreliable. Like him, the gun was a relic from more dangerous times. "I made a choice," he said, unable to meet her eyes. "One night, 30 years ago, I chose mercy over wisdom." Mercy for who? Before Miguel could answer, his phone rang, the old landline that barely worked during storms. The sound made them both freeze. Miguel looked at the caller ID and felt his remaining hope crumble. Local number, but he recognized the area code. Medellin. "Answer it," Isabella urged. Miguel lifted the receiver with trembling fingers. "Sí? Señor Herrera." The voice was male, middle-aged, speaking Spanish with the careful diction of someone used to being obeyed. "My name is Comandante Vasquez. I believe you met my colleague earlier today." Miguel's legs nearly gave out. Comandante, not current military, but someone who'd earned the title during the worst of the narcotics war. Someone from the old days when the line between law enforcement and criminal enterprise had blurred beyond recognition. "I want to make something very clear," Vasquez continued. "What we're seeking doesn't belong to you. It never did. You were simply a caretaker. But your time as guardian has ended." Miguel gripped the phone tighter, aware of Isabella watching his face, reading the fear there. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please, Señor Herrera. We're far past the point of comfortable lies. The briefcase contains information that certain people need to remain buried. We're prepared to pay generously for its return, enough to ensure Isabella's university education and your comfortable retirement." The offer hit Miguel like a physical blow. These people knew everything, not just about that night in 1993, but about Isabella's dreams, her plans, their financial struggles. They'd been watching, cataloging vulnerabilities, preparing for this moment. "And if I refuse?" Miguel asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then Isabella will discover that her grandfather's past contains significantly more blood than she imagines." The line went dead. Miguel stood holding the silent phone, watching through the shed's single window as the motorcycle rider finished his cigarette and climbed back onto his bike. But instead of leaving, he rode a slow circuit around the property's perimeter, marking territory like a predator establishing hunting grounds. Miguel looked at Isabella, at the questions and growing fear in her eyes, and realized that 30 years of peace had finally come due. The briefcase buried beneath the cecropia tree wasn't just evidence of his past, it was the deed to their future, and someone else was calling in the mortgage. The secrets weren't just unraveling anymore, they were about to explode. Miguel set the phone down with hands that barely functioned, his mind reeling from the impact of Vasquez's words. The name struck him like lightning, not because he recognized it, but because he should have. 30 years of willful amnesia had erased so many details from those violent months, but now fragments were surfacing like debris from a long-submerged wreck. "Abuelo," Isabella whispered. "Who was that?" Miguel opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. Something was wrong, not with the call, but with his memory of it. Vasquez had spoken with the authority of someone who'd been there, someone who knew exactly what was in the briefcase. But that was impossible. The only people who could have known were Escobar, Miguel himself, and... The realization hit him like a physical blow. His legs buckled, and he had to grip the shed's workbench to keep from falling. Isabella rushed to steady him, but he barely felt her touch. His mind was racing backward through 30 years of carefully buried memories, searching for details he'd spent decades trying to forget. December 2nd, 1993. The storm. Escobar stumbling from the forest, bleeding from a shoulder wound, carrying the briefcase like it contained his soul. But Miguel had always wondered how the drug lord had known to find him, why he'd chosen this particular farm among hundreds scattered across the mountains. "He knew where to come," Miguel whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. "What?" Isabella's voice seemed to reach him from across a vast distance. Miguel's hands shook as the pieces reassembled themselves into a picture he'd never allowed himself to see. The coffee buyer who'd appeared 3 months before Escobar's visit, the one who'd paid premium prices for Miguel's modest harvest and asked casual questions about the property's layout. The same buyer who'd mentioned, almost in passing, that Miguel's farm would be perfect for someone who needed privacy. Carlos Mendoza, salt and pepper hair, expensive watch, kind eyes. The man who'd single-handedly lifted Miguel's family from the edge of bankruptcy with a contract that seemed too good to be true. Because it was. It was all planned, Miguel breathed, the shed spinning around him. Every bit of it. Isabella grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to focus on her face. Abuelo, you're scaring me. What was planned? Miguel looked at his granddaughter, this beautiful, innocent young woman whose entire existence had been shaped by his choices that night, and felt 30 years of self-deception crumbling like ancient stone. I thought I was saving him, he said, his voice cracking. I thought it was mercy, helping a wounded man, but it was all arranged. They knew exactly where to send him. The truth rolled over him in waves, each revelation more devastating than the last. The mysterious coffee buyer who'd prepared the ground, the convenient storm that had driven away the military patrols, the briefcase that Escobar had guarded so carefully, not his own insurance policy, but something he'd been ordered to deliver. They used me, Miguel whispered. Someone in the government, or the military, or... He couldn't finish the thought. The implications were too vast, too dangerous. Isabella's face had gone pale. Used you for what? Miguel forced himself to stand straighter, to meet her eyes. I was never helping Escobar hide from the authorities, mija. I was helping the authorities hide something from the world. The words hung between them like poison in the air. Outside, the motorcycle rider completed another circuit of the property, his engine note a mechanical heartbeat counting down their remaining time. Miguel's phone rang again. This time, he answered before the first ring finished. Have you remembered where you put our property, Senor Herrera? Vasquez's voice carried amusement now, the satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. You knew, Miguel said, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. You knew I'd never read what was in there. You were counting on it. Simple farmers make the most reliable custodians, Vasquez replied. No curiosity, no ambition, just obedience and fear. We couldn't have chosen better ourselves. The arrogance in his tone sparked something fierce in Miguel's chest. You think I'm still that frightened man who buried your secrets without asking questions? Aren't you? Vasquez's laugh was soft, contemptuous. You've spent 30 years playing farmer, pretending that night never happened. We're simply asking you to maintain that comfortable delusion a little longer. Miguel looked at Isabella, saw the strength in her eyes, the same strength that had carried her grandmother through the worst years of the violence, the same strength that had built this life from nothing but hope and coffee beans. You made one mistake, Miguel said quietly. And what's that? You threatened my granddaughter. Miguel hung up and turned to Isabella, seeing his own determination reflected in her face. The frightened farmer who'd buried secrets without questions was gone. What remained was a man who'd spent 30 years learning what was worth protecting. Now, he said, we dig. The walk to the cecropia tree felt like a funeral procession. Miguel carried the ancient shovel, its handle worn smooth by decades of honest labor, while Isabella followed with a flashlight whose beam cut weak paths through the gathering dusk. The motorcycle's engine had fallen silent 20 minutes ago, but Miguel could feel watching eyes like insects crawling across his skin. There, he said, stopping beneath the massive tree whose canopy had sheltered 30 years of secrets. The roots had grown since 1993, spreading like arthritic fingers through soil that had kept faith with his buried shame. Isabella aimed the flashlight where Miguel pointed, illuminating a patch of ground that looked identical to every other square meter around the tree's base. But Miguel's memory was precise, 3 meters northeast of the trunk, beside the rock that resembled a sleeping dog. The first bite of the shovel into earth felt like breaking a sacred covenant. Miguel had sworn never to disturb this spot, had built an entire life around the principle of letting sleeping devils lie. But Vasquez's arrogance had awakened something in him that 30 years of careful peace couldn't contain. How deep? Isabella asked, playing the light across the growing hole. 2 meters. Miguel's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. He was very specific about that. Said it had to be below the frost line. The memory of Escobar's instructions returned with crystalline clarity. The drug lord had been meticulous despite his wounds, drawing crude diagrams in the dirt, making Miguel repeat the measurements back to him. At the time, Miguel had assumed it was paranoia, the obsessive precision of a man who trusted no one. Now he understood it was professionalism. Escobar had been following someone else's orders. The digging progressed slowly. Miguel's 70-year-old hands cramped around the shovel handle. His back protested each scoop of earth, but he refused Isabella's offers to help. This was his burden to bear, his past to excavate. She could witness it, but she shouldn't have to touch it. "Tell me about that night," Isabella said quietly as he worked. The real story. Miguel paused, leaning on the shovel handle. In the flashlight's harsh beam, his granddaughter looked older than her 20 years, as if the day's revelations had aged her in fast forward. "The storm was biblical," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of confession. "Your grandmother was terrified, not of the weather, but of what might come with it. Those were the worst months, when they were closing in on him. People disappeared for knowing too little, for knowing too much, for being in the wrong place when the hunters passed through. The hole deepened with each memory. Miguel could see that night as if it were happening again, the rain hammering their roof like machine gun fire, the power lines down, the world reduced to whatever their kerosene lamps could illuminate. He appeared at our door like a ghost made flesh, bleeding, exhausted, but still carrying that briefcase like it was the most precious thing in the world. Your grandmother wanted to turn him away. She knew who he was, what helping him might cost us. But I looked at his face and saw—" Miguel struggled for the right words. "I saw someone's son, someone's father, a man who was going to die if we closed our door." Isabella's voice was soft, non-judgmental. "So you let him in." "I let him in." The admission tasted like copper pennies in Miguel's mouth. He stayed 3 hours, long enough for the military patrols to pass, for the immediate danger to fade. He never told us what was in the briefcase, but he made me promise, made me swear on your mother's life, that I would keep it safe until someone came to claim it. The shovel struck something hard. Miguel's heart hammered as he scraped away dirt, revealing a corner of metal wrapped in oiled canvas. The briefcase, exactly where he'd left it 30 years ago, preserved like a time capsule from Colombia's darkest hour. "But no one ever came," Isabella said. Miguel's hands trembled as he cleared more soil from around the case. "I waited 2 years, 3. Eventually I convinced myself that whoever was supposed to collect it had died, that the secret had died with them. I thought I was free. Until today." Until today. Miguel worked the case free from its earthen prison, surprised by how light it felt. In his memory, it had weighed as much as a coffin. "Isabella, whatever's in here, whatever I've been guarding all these years, it's dangerous enough that powerful people will kill to keep it hidden. Maybe we should—" Isabella's voice carried steel he'd never heard before. "They threatened me to control you, abuelo. They made this personal. I want to see what 30 years of fear was protecting." Miguel looked at his granddaughter in the flashlight's glow and saw echoes of her grandmother's fierce courage. Carmen had died 10 years ago, but her strength lived on in this remarkable young woman who refused to be intimidated by shadows from the past. The briefcase's latches opened with a soft click that sounded like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. Inside, wrapped in plastic and preserved like sacred relics, were documents that would change everything. Miguel's hands shook as he lifted the first document from its plastic wrapping. The paper was yellowed but intact, official letterhead visible even in the flashlight's unsteady beam. Isabella leaned closer, her breath catching as Spanish text materialized in the dancing light. "Ministerio de Defensa Nacional," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. Miguel's eyes scanned the page, and 30 years of carefully constructed peace shattered like glass. The document was a communication between high-ranking military officials dated November 1993, just weeks before Escobar's arrival at his farm. But it wasn't about capturing the drug lord. It was about protecting him. "This can't be right," Miguel breathed, his voice cracking. But the evidence was undeniable. Page after page revealed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. Military commanders, politicians, even international intelligence agencies, all coordinating not to eliminate Pablo Escobar, but to extract him safely from Colombia. The public manhunt had been theater. The real plan was exile. Isabella lifted another document. this one bearing the seal of the United States Drug Enforcement Administration. Abuelo, look at this. Miguel read the English text with growing horror. Operation Guardian Angel, a joint American-Colombian initiative to relocate Escobar to a secure facility where he could provide intelligence on rival cartels and government corruption. The briefcase contained communications, bank routing numbers, new identity documents, and most damning of all, a list of officials who had received payments to ensure the operation's success. They were going to fake his death, Isabella said, her voice hollow with disbelief. Make the world think he was killed while they smuggled him out of the country. Miguel's mind reeled as the implications crashed over him like a tide. He hadn't been an unwitting accomplice to harboring a fugitive. He'd been a cog in an international conspiracy to save the world's most wanted man. The briefcase had contained Escobar's new life, his freedom, his future. But he never made it, Miguel realized aloud. Something went wrong. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the mountain silence, multiple engines growing closer. Isabella grabbed Miguel's arm, but he barely felt her touch. His eyes were fixed on the final document in the briefcase, a handwritten note in Escobar's unmistakable scrawl. If you are reading this, then I am dead and the plan has failed. The people named in these documents will kill anyone who threatens their secrets. But the truth must survive, even if I cannot. Find someone who cannot be bought, cannot be threatened, who will choose justice over survival. He knew, Miguel whispered. Even then, he knew they would betray him. Car doors slammed in the distance. Flashlight beams began sweeping through the coffee grove below their position. Miguel looked at Isabella and saw his own transformation reflected in her face, the end of innocence, the burden of terrible knowledge. What do we do? She asked. Miguel stared at the documents scattered between them, evidence of corruption that reached across borders and decades. For 30 years, he had been the guardian of a truth so explosive that it could topple governments, destroy careers, rewrite history. The frightened farmer who had buried these secrets without reading them was gone. What remained was a man who finally understood the weight of his choices. Comandante Vasquez made one critical error, Miguel said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. What? He assumed I would remain the same man who helped Escobar 30 years ago. Someone who could be controlled through fear, who would choose comfortable lies over dangerous truth. Miguel began gathering the documents, handling them with the reverence they demanded. Each page represented lives destroyed, justice perverted, truth murdered in its cradle. But they also represented something else, the possibility of redemption. The flashlight beams were closer now, voices calling through the trees. Miguel recognized the tone if not the words, the casual cruelty of men who had never been denied what they wanted. Isabella, he said, meeting her eyes in the flashlight's glow, your grandmother once told me that some secrets are too heavy for one person to carry alone. She was right. What are you saying? Miguel smiled, feeling decades of fear lift from his shoulders like morning mist. I'm saying that some truths are worth dying for, but more importantly, they're worth living for. He handed Isabella the documents, watching her face as she accepted the weight of history. Around them, the search was intensifying, but Miguel felt only clarity. The past and present had finally collided, shattering the careful distance he had maintained between who he was and who he had pretended to be. For 30 years, he had been Pablo Escobar's unwitting guardian. Tonight, he would become something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The truth was no longer buried. Now, it would either set them free or destroy them all. Resolution. 6 months later, Miguel sat on his porch in the golden hour before sunset, watching his granddaughter tend the coffee plants that had survived everything, storms, secrets, and the kind of truth that reshapes the world. The mountains stretched before them, unchanged and eternal, indifferent to the human dramas that played out in their shadows. The international headlines had faded now, relegated to archived web pages and academic discussions. Colombian military corruption scandal spans 3 decades. Operation Guardian Angel, how Pablo Escobar nearly escaped justice. Farmer's testimony exposes international conspiracy. For 6 weeks, Miguel's weathered face had appeared on television screens around the world, as he testified before tribunals, spoke to journalists, and watched powerful men in expensive suits led away in handcuffs. But the cameras were gone now, and the reporters had found fresher scandals to chase. What remained was this: the same porch, the same mountains, the same coffee farm that had harbored history's most dangerous secret. Yet everything was different. Isabella emerged from the coffee grove, her hands stained with earth and her face bright with the satisfaction of honest work. She had stayed through everything: the death threats, the attempts at intimidation, the surreal weeks when their small farm had become the center of an international investigation. When the Colombian prosecutor had offered them witness protection, new identities in a distant country, she had been the one to refuse. "This is our home," she had said simply. "We don't run from the truth, we live with it." Miguel smiled at the memory. His granddaughter had inherited more than Carmen's fierce courage. She had found her own strength in the crucible of those terrible and transformative weeks. "The evening light is beautiful today," Isabella said, settling into the chair beside him. Between them sat the small wooden table where Miguel had once read his newspapers in blissful ignorance, where he had learned to see the world as a simple place with clear boundaries between right and wrong. "Your grandmother always loved this time of day," Miguel said softly. "She used to say that sunset was when the day confessed its secrets to the night." They sat in comfortable silence, watching shadows lengthen across the valley. In the distance, Miguel could see the cecropia tree where they had unearthed 30 years of buried truth. The earth there had been carefully restored, the hole filled, the secret finally released from its underground prison. Sometimes Miguel imagined he could breathe easier now, as if the land itself had exhaled a breath it had been holding since 1993. The sound of a vehicle approaching broke their reverie. Miguel tensed reflexively, an old man's habit born from months of justified paranoia, but this was just Father Martinez, making his weekly visit to check on them. The priest had become a regular presence since the story broke, offering spiritual guidance to a man grappling with the moral complexity of his choices. "Miguel, Isabella." Father Martinez climbed the porch steps with the careful gait of a man fighting his own battles with time. "How are you holding up?" "We survive," Miguel replied, the same answer he gave everyone who asked. It was both truth and understatement. They had done more than survive. They had endured, adapted, found peace in the aftermath of chaos. The priest settled into the third chair, completing a triangle of unlikely companions. "The church received another letter of gratitude today," he said quietly, "from the family of that journalist in Bogotá who was killed in 1994. They said your testimony finally gave them answers they'd been seeking for decades." Miguel nodded slowly. The letters had been arriving steadily, from families of the disappeared, from journalists whose investigations had been silenced, from ordinary people whose lives had been destroyed by the conspiracy he had unknowingly protected. Each letter was a small absolution, a reminder that sometimes the right choice reveals itself only in retrospect. "Do you ever wonder," Father Martinez asked gently, "what would have happened if you had opened that briefcase 30 years ago?" Miguel considered the question he had asked himself countless times. "I was a different man then, frightened, focused only on my family's survival. I'm not sure I would have had the courage to act on what I found. And now?" Miguel looked at Isabella, who was listening with the patient attention she had shown throughout his long journey toward understanding. "Now I know that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to do what's right despite the fear." The sun had nearly disappeared behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. Miguel felt the familiar peace that came with evening, but it was different now, deeper, earned through fire rather than simply inherited from routine. Father Martinez stood to leave, but paused at the porch steps. "You know, Miguel, I think your grandmother would be proud of the man you've become." As the priest's vehicle disappeared down the mountain road, Miguel reached across the small table and took Isabella's hand. Her grip was strong, steady, unafraid. "What are you thinking about, abuelo?" Miguel smiled, feeling the weight of years and choices settling around him like a familiar blanket. "I'm thinking that some stories never really end. They just change the people who live them." Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, silent witnesses to all the secrets the mountains had kept and finally released.